So today's pre-conference is going to focus on governing and finance. To run a successful home care cooperative, you need to understand the industry, and you also need to understand the cooperative, being a cooperative. And today's program is going to focus on that cooperative aspect of the program. We're going to begin with two seasoned cooperative developers, Courtney Berner, the Executive Director of the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives, and Deborah Craig, the co-op development specialist at Northwest Cooperative Development Center in Washington State. And I might mention that Washington State has the most home care cooperatives of any place in the country, not the largest number of cooperative. CHCA, of course, is the largest cooperative, but Washington State has the most home care cooperatives. So Deborah has an extensive experience in the home care area, and many of you know Deborah. So Courtney and Deborah bring a lot of experience in the cooperative governance space, as well as an understanding of home care cooperatives. So I will turn the program over to Courtney and Deborah, with, I believe, Courtney speaking first. So Courtney, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie. We were really lamenting earlier the fact that we don't all get to be in person for connecting and bowling. So here's hoping next year we get to be together again. So as I'm pulling up my slides, I just wanted to, if you noticed that when you signed in, your name was Kirsty Boyette and your name isn't Kirsty Boyette, if you could take a moment to rename yourself. If you're an individual, maybe just put your name and as well as your co-op name. If it's a co-op you're joining all together, maybe just put the name of the co-op. But I'll be using, or we'll be using, the chat later as a way to interact a bit. And it would be, I think, more helpful if we're able to know who comments are coming from. So if you could just take a minute to do that. And if you need help with that, I'm sure people are standing by to help if you message them. So, all right, we should be good to go. So as Leslie mentioned, Deborah, Craig, and I will be talking about cooperative governance, specifically home care cooperative governance. And this is really a quick overview. This is a pre-con sort of governance 101 session. So we'll be covering a lot of the basics during our time here together. So a quick governance overview. Then Deborah will talk a bit about democracy, really starting with the members and what worker democracy looks like in a home care cooperative. Then we'll turn to a bit of content on the board of directors. And lastly, we'll talk a bit about how we might think about monitoring our governance systems. So first of all, what is governance? Governance is one of those words that I think we all know what it means, sort of, but if asked to define it on the spot, might stumble a little bit, or maybe that's just me. But when I think of governance, I think of it as the way an enterprise or entity or a nation is controlled and how decisions are made. So at its most basic level, that's what we're talking about when we talk about governance. And then governance systems are really how we carry out, how we execute that control, how we operationalize those decision-making processes within our cooperative. And so in a cooperative, governance is, decisions are made, power is distributed through principle number 2. So democratic member control, the way our cooperatives are governed, is really built into the DNA of cooperatives, and all cooperatives across the world, regardless of whether they're worker cooperatives or consumer cooperatives, whether they're in retail grocery or home care or provision of electricity, adhere to these 7 cooperative principles. So at a very basic level, this is what we're talking about when we talk about the governance system within a cooperative. So you have the members, and cooperatives are really member-centric organizations. They exist to meet the needs social or economic or other needs of members rather than maximizing profit. And so members are really the most important piece of this puzzle, in that without the members, there's no cooperative. So the members have decision-making power and authority in different ways in a cooperative. One of the key ways is members elect the board and they approve changes to bylaws. They may participate in other ways in committees, or other leadership bodies within the cooperative. They may be asked to provide input on certain decisions. But really they delegate a lot of their authority to the board of directors to really carry out the mission of the cooperative and set the vision and monitor the business on their behalf. So that board of directors in a cooperative is elected by and from the members, and the board sets policy, they select and supervise management. They set that strategic vision for the cooperative, and they monitor the cooperative to make sure that it is moving towards that vision that was set out by the members. And we'll talk more about the role of members and the board of directors later during the presentation. Next is management, and the board is responsible for selecting management and then playing sort of this dual role of supervising management, but also being sort of a sounding board and strategy partner for management. So management carries out the operational sort of directives of the board. They might hire and supervise the other employees within the cooperative, but they're often one of the main liaisons with the board. And then there are employees. And of course, as you all know, being in worker cooperatives, in a worker cooperative, those employees, hopefully some large portion of them are also members in the cooperative. And thus those employees are members and then maybe on the board of directors as well. So it's more of a closed loop in a worker cooperative. So that's just a basic overview of the cooperative governance system. So now I'm going to turn it to Deborah, and Deborah, you can just cue me when you'd like me to go to your next slide to talk a little bit about the role of members in the system.
Great. All right, so I am here to talk about kind of the members' role, and I want to start by talking about, answer this question, what is workplace democracy? So workplace democracy is those democratic practices put into action in the workplace. And so the emphasis here is on action, the action of taking the values that we associate with democracy, values like equity, fairness, or equality, and then turning them into practices in the workplace. So in cooperatives, we often define democracy through that concept of one person, one vote. But I think we need to expand on that a bit, because members really must have more ways to participate in their democratic workplace other than voting to make it truly meaningful. They need to see democracy in action more than just once a year at your board election. And I think that's the challenge for home care cooperatives. How do we bring democracy alive within our co-op? How do we implement democratic practices within an industry like home care where workers are often working in isolation and rarely see another member? And how do we ensure that we're creating systems that raise member voices and not just pay lip service to member control? Speaking of lip service, I wanted to share this with you all. I recently ran across an ad for a caregiver in a memory care facility. And so that ad caught my eye, but what it said was, it had the headline, "You're the boss, choose your own schedule, work when you want." And so of course that caught my eye, but I later thought, now how could that really work in a facility? How would it work for caregivers to choose their own schedule? So I called because I wanted to find out how they do that. And this is what I was told. We have 3 shifts a day. We have a day shift, a swing shift, and a night shift, and you can choose which one you want. So that was their idea of choosing your own schedule or being your own boss, example of paying lip service. And so I think as cooperators, we don't want to fall into some kind of watered down version of workplace democracy. We need to do the hard work necessary to keep it alive. Next slide. So looking at the members' role in workplace democracy, I think many worker co-ops, and I believe all of the home care co-ops, govern through a system of representational democracy. So members choose their representatives, which is the board of directors, to represent them and their best interests in planning and decision-making related to the co-op. So that structure of representational democracy, it might lead some to believe that the member's role is minor and that they have a smaller role in workplace democracy and that the board is the real decision maker. And I would argue that just really the opposite is true. They, that the co-ops first, they exist to meet the needs of the members. So fulfilling member needs should be really at the heart of everything that we do. So when we talk about what the member's role is, I think, these actions, and I wanted to note again that these are all actions. It's not feelings, it's actions. So that we want our members to, of course, act in the best interest of the cooperative. In order to do that, they need to know what is the best interest of the cooperative. We need to engage them in that. Attend member meetings. This is where a lot of the exchange of ideas happens. We also want them to contribute their ideas and suggestions to benefit the co-op, and at the same time raise complaints or concerns for the improvement of the co-op. And then also to promote cooperative principles. Next slide. So what does a member need in order to participate in workplace democracy? What is the responsibility of the co-op to provide the member? So I think first of all, in order to participate, a member needs an understanding of the co-op's decision-making process. Whether that be consensus or majority vote or sociocracy, are the members really clear about the decision-making process and how they will participate? Are they clear about what decisions that they will participate in directly and what decisions are made by the board or the manager? So they will need training and education to understand that decision-making process. They also need, of course, access to information. So to have meaningful democratic participation, the members must have information about the business, about the policies, financial information. They need information on your strategic goals. They need to know what the threats and opportunities facing the co-op are. And that access to information really needs to be inclusive. So it needs to, sometimes needs to be presented in many different forms. So I think that's a good challenge to the co-ops, is to think about how accessible your co-op information is. And we also need a culture of open communication. So members must feel free to express their ideas and concerns and to know that they're going to be safe from any kinds of repercussions. So in a culture of open communication, well, that also includes debate and the free exchange of ideas. We need to be comfortable with conflict and moving towards resolution. And I think we also, to really have a culture of open communication, we need to cultivate the skill of deep listening. We need to be able to really understand our members' needs. And another one that I left off that slide is clear avenues for participation. So those avenues for participation must be evident and transparent and open to all. So that could be like member forums at your board meetings. It might be surveying your members for gathering information. It's certainly everyone trained in knowing how to get a topic on your board agenda, how to make a proposal, what is involved in running for the board. So all of those avenues of participation should be just clear and evident and open to all. Next slide. And fostering democratic participation. Well, as we know, workplace democracy doesn't just happen by itself. It takes time and planning, and it also takes resources. And workplace democracy, it needs to be nurtured and tended to, because when we don't give it our attention, when we don't prioritize it, it suffers. And I really think this prioritizing workplace democracy is something that should be at the forefront of our minds. I think it's common with worker co-ops that, you know, we really focus on the business side, and we think of the co-op side as maybe secondary. And I really want to encourage you all to really look at your democratic practices and how can you prioritize training for your members. I think that we also need to look at removing any barriers. And I think it's important that we don't assume that we know what the barriers are. We got to ask our members, if you're not participating, why? Where are the barriers? What is getting in the way? It could be that, you know, are your reports and your co-op information presented in the language spoken by your members? Do you have meetings at times that work for your members? And then what system do you have in place for people who aren't able to attend meetings? You know, now a lot of us are meeting by Zoom. Does everyone have the technology to participate? So what are those barriers and really how we can break them down? Of course, having effective communication systems. And I wanted to share this. I was working with a small co-op, and we were talking about how do we know if we have these communication systems, how do we know if they're effective or not? And someone said to me, it's not a problem with the systems. We have really good systems, but no one uses them. So I would say that those are probably not very effective systems. So, you know, really look at the systems that you have, and do they cultivate openness and also encourage participation. And this last one, engaging members in problem solving and strategic planning. I put this here to make the point that we really should include our members in the real business decisions. You know, I recently read this article. It was talking all about how the kind of the financial benefits of workplace democracy. So other corporations are seeing that there's a benefit for people working together and having ownership. And in this article, I wanted to tell you that a couple of their ideas for examples of workplace democracy were allowing your employees to make their own job title. And another one was allowing employees to vote on what color to paint the break room. So I give you those as examples to say that, you know, that is not workplace democracy. We want to engage our members in the real decision-making of the business. And I would encourage you to think of your caregivers as problem solvers, because they solve problems every day in their work. They are natural problem solvers. And so bring them into those real decisions that affect the business. And lastly, I just wanted to remind you that workplace democracy, again, is it's not a feeling, it's not everyone getting along, and it's certainly not everyone agreeing all the time. It often includes disagreement and debate and exchange of ideas. It also includes conflict, and it includes speaking up even when it's difficult. Democracy is hard work, and it's often messy. It requires us to think beyond our own self-interest and to consider the greater good. And I would say that workplace democracy is hard work, but it's work worth doing. I think Courtney's going to talk to us about the role of the board.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think that was such a great sort of segue between talking about the governance system and talking about the role of the board, and really not skipping the really important role that members play. I think sometimes boards, especially when times are tough, can feel really stressed out. They can feel a little alone in solving problems and setting the strategy. And I loved Deborah's recommendation of, look to your members as problem solvers, as co-conspirators in this business, because they're, one of your greatest assets is your team. So thank you. So I'm going to turn to, and I had to laugh at the painting the break room, because I feel like for those of us in the co-op world, when people are critical of the democratic control piece, or how do you get anything done, all making decisions together. One of the things I often say, I'm like, well, you're not making all the decisions together. You're not sitting around for hours talking about what color to, paint the office. So I thought that was funny that it came up as an actual recommendation for workplace democracy. Because as someone who thinks that, having more people involved in the decisions might take a little bit longer, but it often leads to better outcomes. But rarely are we talking about paint colors. So turning to the board of directors, and I think interestingly, looking at some of that bolded language in my slide is pretty similar to one of the things that Deborah just said about members. Members have a responsibility to act in the best interests of the cooperative. And directors are, when they're elected to serve on the board on behalf of members, their really highest calling, highest legal duty is to be a fiduciary. And that, you're safeguarding the assets, the well-being of that cooperative on behalf of the members. And you're ethically bound to act in the best interests of the cooperative and of those members. So that's really, we'll talk a lot more details about what that looks like, but ultimately that is what being a director is all about. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through this content. I'm going to try to not speak too quickly since I know we have simultaneous interpretation, but move through this content pretty quickly. You'll have access to all of these slides, but I want to make sure that we have adequate time for questions at the end. So just what is the role of the board in all of this? We just talked about some of the ways in which members are responsible for maintaining this democratic workplace, participating, making sure that they know where to get information, helping to cultivate a culture of open communication, healthy conflict, and decision-making. So to the role of the board, I mentioned this in that opening slide, really safeguarding the assets on behalf of members, watching how the business is doing, and making sure that you're sort of steering the ship in the right direction. Hiring and supervising management is another key, very important role of the board, making sure that there is a good match between the manager or the management team and the co-op, making sure that there's clear communication between the board and management, annual appraisal and evaluation, succession planning. There's a lot built into that role of the board. Guiding strategy. So the folks who are working, in a worker co-op, the people on the board are also workers. So, but when you take off your governance hat and put on your worker hat, you're really focused on carrying out the day-to-day activities of the cooperative. But when you're in the boardroom, you're more focused on strategy, long-term objectives, culture of the cooperative. Assessing the co-op's performance, part of that has to do with assessing management, but how is the co-op performing you know, financially, but also how well are we meeting members' needs? There are a lot of different ways to measure a cooperative success beyond just financial performance, although that's certainly an important one, as Margaret Lund will talk about later in the session today. Preserving the co-op's character. So that I think is something that is, you know, we sometimes don't think about that, but maintaining a really strong brand for your cooperative, that you're well respected in the community, that's a core part of being a successful business. And so the board certainly plays a role in that as well. If there's a big snafu that happens, the more the board might want to be out in front of that, communicating to members and to the community. Revitalizing and sustaining the governance structure. So this is not something we outsource to others. It is our responsibility to make sure that our governance structure is healthy, that our systems are sound, that we have you know, a good pipeline of directors coming into the board, that we have a successful and sort of thorough orientation process for new board members. But it's our responsibility. You know, of course you can call in people to help with training, help guide you with things, but really it's the board's responsibility. It's not the manager's responsibility to make sure that that governance structure is sound. Building an influential team capable of opposing management when necessary. That can, that sort of got to that dynamic that I mentioned earlier, that the board is supporting management, but also holding management accountable, which is a bit of a paradox. It can be sort of an uncomfortable tension, but it's really, you know, built into the job. The other, again, serve as a trusted advisor to management, represent and communicate with co-op members. You know, when Deborah was talking earlier about, you know, do we know what the barriers are to participation for members? We worked with Cooperative Care here in Wisconsin on doing member surveys in the past to really try to understand what's going on with members. Are we meeting their needs? What barriers exist to participation? So that's another really important role for the board. And then aligning the co-op strategy with the members' long-term interest. And so this can be another one of those sort of tricky paradoxes where what the members might want in a year, you know, maybe the members really want a patronage dividend, but the cooperative is not in a position to pay one out this year. Sort of balancing those tough questions about, you know, rewarding members, meeting members' needs, but also making sure that, you know, the co-op is on sound footing for the long haul. Okay, so what is the role of management? And I know in some of your cooperatives, you know, you may have managers on your board. Not only are they members, but they're members of the board. And so this gets a little messy. As Deborah mentioned, democracy isn't always easy. It can be hard, it can be messy, it can be a little uncomfortable, and there tend to be a lot of gray areas. So I think a key, even if we're holding different roles within a cooperative, really understanding, you know, when we have our management hat on, when we have our board hat on, when we have our worker hat out in the field, sort of what are the different, how do we create some boundaries between those roles that might make carrying them out a little easier. So role of management, handle day-to-day operations, hire and supervise employees, provide financial information to the board. So often you'll have someone on the, you know, either a chief financial officer or the general manager or executive director who is putting together monthly reports for the board so that the board can do its job, you know, monitoring how the cooperative is doing. Assure quality control. Often interacting with customers, in addition to interacting with employees, preparing an annual budget. Often this is a process that is carried out sort of in partnership between the board and management. A manager might prepare the budget, but then the board is reviewing it and approving it, might be making some suggestions to changes, but it's important that that budgeting process is taking place. And then implementing strategy. So if the board is in the role of setting sort of the high level strategy, it's then management who takes that strategy and runs with it, who operationalizes that strategy. and then arranging necessary financing. So a board might need to approve going after a loan or some other form of financing, but it's really the role of management to make the arrangements for that. So, and then there are some gray areas. So I alluded to this, some gray areas that might be shared between the board of management. And these are, you know, related to the manager's professional improvement and work plan. You know, anytime that there is someone who's sort of reporting, so you know, people who report to me, we work together on their plans and their goals for the year, and they're certainly really driven by that employee, but you know, I have input and provide guidance on that. So it's the same here between the board and the manager. I mentioned sort of major mishaps. If there's some sort of crisis, the board, you know, typically the manager or staff might have sort of responsible for the main channels of communication with employees and with the public. But in the case of some sort of crisis or mishap, the board may want to step in, or at least, you know, the board and management have a conversation about the plan for communicating about that issue. Keeping members informed, again, you know, ultimately is the responsibility of the board to make sure that it happens, but management is likely, or employees are likely carrying that out on the day-to-day. So there are other gray areas that I could add to this list, but I think with the key issue with these gray areas is just to be aware of them and to remember that these are areas where before the board or management acts, there should likely be a conversation. So now I want to encourage you to think about this question. What factors might break down that board management relationship? So I want you to type into the chat, give this question some thought. What factors might break down that board management relationship? What might happen that could cause some fractures there? So if you could just enter your answers in. So yep, thank you. Lack of mutual respect, definitely. And these could be big things, they could be little things. Lack of participation, yep. I feel like I was on a session yesterday with a bunch of grocery cooperative board members all afternoon, and we talked about accountability and how when people don't do what they say they're going to do, that leads pretty quickly to frustration and resentment, which are not things we want to, don't lead to positive outcomes. Poor communication, yes, definitely. Ego. So again, that ego could mean a lot of different things, but even just, you know, putting our own needs ahead of the needs of the broader membership or the cooperative. Miscommunication. So sometimes it wasn't, you know, intentional. There was just a misunderstanding. Lack of transparency. Yep. So often if people feel like information's being withheld, unfortunately, we don't always give people the benefit of the doubt. You know, we sometimes think the worst. Lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities. Exactly. So we might feel frustrated by what someone is or is not doing if we don't understand that it is or is not part of their actual role within the cooperative. That's why I think member education, board education, ongoing education is just really so important, especially as you have new people coming in to the boardroom and into the cooperative. Difficulty defining boundaries. Yep, I think especially if some of us have been working together for a long time. I've been at the Center for Co-ops for almost 10 years, which is kind of crazy to say out loud. You know, I've worked with some of my colleagues for a long time. We're good friends, and it can, there's, you have to be careful about some of those boundaries. It's one of the great gifts of working with people for a long time, but sometimes can be challenging. Lack of resources, absolutely. Lack of resources creates stress, creates the sense of not having enough time sometimes to attend to details. Busy people, I see, greed, misunderstandings, wanting to move faster than the process. Yep, I think sometimes people, we certainly fall along a continuum, but some of us are really, really process focused and some of us are really, really outcome focused. And we get frustrated if it feels like the process is taking too long. Some of us feel really unsatisfied if we feel like the process wasn't followed. And so you likely have people who fall along different parts of that continuum within your cooperative. Missing experience and leadership capabilities. Sometimes we end up in positions that we aren't trained for. You know, I didn't have a lot of management experience when I stepped into my current role, and you kind of learn on the job and hope that people are, you know, patient with you as you learn. So, and I'm sorry, I can't read the Spanish one. I don't speak Spanish. I speak French, but not Spanish. I think it says something about the values and principles of cooperatives. That is why it is important to practice and emphasize cooperative values and principles to create strong ties. Awesome, thank you, Clarissa. So yeah, I think great. This is why I wanted to ask for your input, because we all have a sense of what can cause things to go wrong. So I have a list that really reflects a lot of what you all said. And I think something I didn't maybe see was really a difference in objectives and values between the board and management. So that's why, you know, doing strategic planning together is so important. Really making sure that you're on the same team and that you have the same ideas about why the co-op exists and what you're doing to serve members. All right. And I'll say, you know, we mentioned that conflict within the board of directors can be a problem as well. It's really hard to report to a board that is having a lot of conflict. And again, I want to repeat what Deborah said, that conflict isn't bad. Conflict is actually really necessary for making decisions. And, you know, anytime you're working in a group long term, there will be conflict. The question is, how do you move through it? How do you handle it? How do you make it productive rather than destructive? All right, so we're gonna bop through these pretty quickly. Some tools for increasing board effectiveness. We'll touch on meetings, committees, ground rules. I could literally talk about meetings for like an hour, so I'm gonna do pretty high level. Always happy to have a follow-up conversation with folks or to direct you to some of our other webinars that we have on our UWCC website about these topics. So 3 things I just want to mention for meetings. I had to update my slide with a Zoom meeting, because I think that's how a lot of us are meeting these days. Just want to mention the importance of agendas. You know, setting an agenda really puts boundaries on the meeting. It forces the agenda writer, which is likely the board chair, to really reflect on what the most important topics are. It communicates to the participants what you'll be discussing, what is important to review ahead of the meeting. Will I be asked to make decisions on key topics? What materials do I need to review ahead of the meeting? So agendas, and they help, they also sort of communicate what's most important in terms of, you know, how much time is allotted to each agenda item. So I really, if you don't feel like you have good resources on agenda setting, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. This is like a weird area of expertise and passion that I've developed in the last couple of years, because I've just seen how much of a difference strong facilitation and really good meeting agendas can make. So meeting roles, typically there'll be one person who is facilitating board meetings. Sometimes boards will rotate. Typically it's the board chair, vice chair, or vice president if the board chair is gone. I encourage you to think about roles beyond facilitator. So can someone take maybe the timekeeper, and that takes something off of the plate of that facilitator. Let me see here. And then obviously you probably have someone who's taking minutes. I encourage everyone, if you're able, to get some kind of facilitation training for your whole board, or meeting training. I think learning about what the facilitator is trying to do makes all of us better meeting participants. And then of course, meeting minutes. This is like a core board document that documents you know, what decisions were made, who was at the meeting. It is not a he said, she said, they said, you know, every detail, but you really, you know, really as a board, this is a part of that transparency piece too, is making sure that the members have access to, you know, how is the board doing its business, and really meetings are how the board does its business, and meeting minutes are that sort of legal record of what decisions the board made on behalf of members. So those are important. I want to talk a little bit about committees, especially if a board is feeling burned out, like how can you really use committees effectively? They are designed not to replace the board, not to have their own real decision-making power, but they can be deployed to do things like organizing an event or some sort of short-term process. So I mentioned earlier member surveys. And maybe you have a committee, maybe you have a membership committee that is responsible for member orientation materials and an annual member survey, just an idea. Committees are great for doing sort of detailed work, either planning or research or writing that is just like sort of painful to do in a much larger group. And then they can bring back what they find, what they do to the board. So there's just like this extra arm of the board that can go out and do some work of the board and bring it back, save the board some time. The board still gets to have input and make the ultimate decision about how the board's moving forward. But they're a great tool. And so, yeah, they're typically crafting proposals for the board to review or just bringing information back to the board that then the board can use to make decisions. Committees are also a great way to involve other members in the sort of democratic processes of your co-op. And so think creatively about that. It's a great way for developing your leadership pipeline. So if someone has sat on a committee or two, they might be a really great candidate to recruit to run for the board. I do strongly encourage folks to use committee charters. One of the things about owning a business and running a business together that's really different from just being an individual entrepreneur or business owner out on your own is it's so important to write things down to make sure that y'all are on the same page. If you're on your own running a business and a lot of that stuff lives in your head, that's really okay. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's okay. But if you, some of the things that I saw come up in that, in response to my question about what, where do we see, what might lead to a breakdown between management and the board, lack of transparency, misunderstandings, maybe people don't understand their roles, poor communication, lack of clarity. So really encourage you, if you're going to use committees, which I think y'all should be doing, to make sure you're writing down why that committee exists. Is it a committee that is, an ad hoc committee, so a short-term committee that you're just putting in place for one process, or is it a standing committee? What sort of authority does that committee have? And what size, is it just board members that are on the committee, or are there board members and individual members of the cooperative? How do people get appointed to the committee? And just really laying out sort of the scope and authority of that committee. And then that helps to reduce confusion or lack of transparency or misunderstandings later on. Lastly, I'll just mention ground rules. I think these are sort of like several things in this bucket that really just all point to, how do we do our work together? Not just as a board, but as cooperators. And so group agreements are something that we often, if I'm running a retreat for a board, we'll do at the beginning of the retreat. How are we committed to showing up and working together today? What's important to us? I encourage, those co-ops to bring those ground rules, those group agreements back to their co-op. Put them up in your boardroom or in your break room. They're a nice, if you've done the work to come up with them, you can have them live on. Conflict of interest policy, that might live in your bylaws. Again, we could talk for a long time about conflict of interest. The issue is not to avoid all conflict of interest, is to have a system in place for when they arise. How do we handle them as a group? Confidentiality, what are we asking board members to keep confidential? Often things related to legal issues, real estate, performance evaluations, things like that. A code of conduct, I've seen those used pretty effectively on boards. And then really just back to basics, director position descriptions, sort of back to that idea of the more we have clarity about what our roles and responsibilities are, the better. And so, you know, I have a job description for my job, and that's sort of the basis of how I'm evaluated at the end of the year too. It's a big piece. It helps really guide my actions throughout the year. So I think that can be important for boards too. So I want to spend just a minute here talking about how do we monitor our governance system. So we set these up. How do we know that they're working? I loved Deborah's story about someone saying, we have great systems, it's just that nobody uses them. So there might be a problem with the systems there if no one is actually using them. They might not be so great. Or they might be great systems, but they're not effective in that context. So I just want to give you a couple ideas of places. So in the boardroom, you know, having check-ins after meetings, going around, you know, how did that go for you? Again, this is normalizing some of the, those difficult conversations too. The more we can normalize, whether it's talking about conflict of interest, talking about giving really constructive feedback. So maybe it's, you know, what's one thing that you thought went well today at this meeting, and one thing we could do better next time. Having one-on-one meetings. So often, you know, boards I've served on, the board chair will take time to have one-on-one meetings with the other directors just to check in and see how things are going for those directors, make sure that they feel like they have what they need to do their job. I conduct board self-evaluations with boards, which are great. I think they're a great tool. Sometimes things that people feel uncomfortable saying, or dynamics that people feel under the surface but aren't talking about, can be surfaced in a board self-evaluation, and we can come up with a really constructive way to have those conversations. I encourage doing a board self-evaluation maybe once a year. How do we check in to make sure the members, Deborah did a great job talking about members, but I think some other, I mentioned member surveys already, listening sessions are another way to hear from members, you know, beyond just your annual meeting. What are other ways? You know, Deborah mentioned like democracy within a worker co-op isn't just about voting. Engaging members isn't just about the annual meeting either. What are more regular ways that we can check in with members? And then there, you know, two real sets of documents, our policies and our bylaws, that lend structure to our governance systems. A lot of people don't like to mess with these, but, you know, having a review every year or two of your bylaws and policies, making sure that they're relevant and still meeting the needs of your cooperative. So I will stop there. And I will unshare my screen. All right.
Okay, I think I'm the one that's filled in some questions for you guys, for you both. So Deborah, maybe you can get back on. There's one really good question. We only have a few minutes, but I thought this was a great question. So because boards are so important, what can co-ops do to support the capacity of their members to serve on the board? And I would like you both to talk about that a little bit, because that is just a super important question. So Deborah, why don't you go first, and then Courtney?
Okay, could you read that one more time?
Yeah, here, I'll even look at the actual words that somebody said. Okay, since the role of the board is so essential to caring for the co-op and overseeing its work, how do the home care co-ops help support workers to build the capacity to serve on the board?
That's a great question. I think, you know, it really starts with prioritizing, making the training of your members in workplace democracy as important as training them to be caregivers to serve your clients. You know, we have chosen this as a way to govern our co-op. So we have that responsibility of making sure people have the knowledge and skills that they need. So investing in it always goes back to investing the time and resources in training. And then, you know, within that, there's many different techniques you could use. Some boards will use a mentor system. New board members come on and they're mentored by an older member or a more seasoned member. Yeah, so there are different techniques you can engage, but I think overall is like, you know, make sure that you all share that commitment to giving the training and education in the space needed.
Okay, Courtney, do you have something to add?
Only, that was great. Only that if you're able, and I think a lot of co-ops do this, sort of a slightly different take on the question, is being able to compensate board members for the time they're spending on their board work, taking it seriously as work of the co-op. So. Okay,
great. We had another question that was about a conflict of interest. Somebody asked for an example of a conflict of interest policy, which I hope we can share just in the chat or someplace else. But I think that also asks for, you know, a bigger question. Why don't you just, again, both of you, what are some thoughts you have on conflict of interest policy? Because obviously we're all owners of the same co-op, so, you know, we have a lot of relationships. What's your kind of take on what, you know, what's the good parameters, I guess, of a conflict of interest policy for a worker-owned co-op? Courtney?
I'm all about disclosure. I mean, really, okay. It's like disclose, 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 how to create a culture where, I mean, I was on a board, not of a worker co-op, of a grocery co-op once, where part of our like check-ins at the beginning of board meetings, I don't, you know, I do or do not have a conflict of interest related to today's agenda. Most people didn't most meetings, but, and then having, you know, and I'm happy to share some policy examples afterwards, but having, you know, what the board then decides, you know, when someone has a conflict, do they get to participate in the discussion? Do they get to participate in the decision? Do they actually have to leave the room? So they're sort of laying out the options for when someone discloses one, and then making sure that the board knows that then they get to decide how to proceed.
Great. Deborah, could you add?
Yeah, I'll take the other side of that and talk about what is not conflict of interest, because I think sometimes board members would like to use that as a way to not make a decision. And it's because it's a difficult decision, right? So if you are thinking that I cannot make a decision about, let's say, this person's membership because they're my friend, that's not a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. You have to step up and make that decision in the best interest of your cooperative.
Yeah, that's a great point. Getting clear on what is and is not conflict of interest is, yeah. And you can't just say, you can't just accuse someone of having a conflict if you don't like their position.
Okay, great. We have 1 minute left, which is, okay, I'm gonna just put this other one that was in. Should the manager be a member of the co-op or not? Deborah.
I used to have a strong opinion about that, and I no longer do. So, yeah, I really, you know, with the home care co-op that I was first involved with, we made a conscious decision for the management to not be members. We felt that we already had a huge influence on the organization. So to also have that, it just felt like overkill. But then, since then, I have seen different co-ops evolve and really want their manager to be a member. And I think it's, you know, I see somebody just asking, should management be on the board? And I think that would be a good distinction to make, that that although they could be members, that they not serve on the board. I personally would advocate for that type of policy, just because, like I was saying, they already have a tremendous amount of influence, and this should serve as a kind of checks and balances. So yeah, Courtney?
I agree. You know, and I've seen co-ops change their tune depending who's in that manager role, which is not a criticism, but I think sometimes it's situational in terms of what feels comfortable and what doesn't. And I generally agree with not having the manager on the board. I've also seen worker co-ops where the manager has been the chair of the board and it worked. And so it's, you know, it's really a co-op specific thing, and we have some best practices, but it's a decision worth talking through.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of our time. Is that correct?
Break. We are coming back at 1:30. So
yeah.
Everybody, thank you so much for our panelists, and thank you to our participants. Good questions, and we'll come back for finance this afternoon at 1:30. So see you then.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Good job.